It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You could find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting if you just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our guest today, Matt Sergiou from Conspiro Media and Occult Beatles. You can go there and find all our previous interviews with him. And also, too, I even have a channel for him called Occult Beatles, where we would play his podcast. So we have today back with us Matt Sergiou. You can find him at Conspiro Media, WordPress.com, Occult Beatles at WordPress.com. On Facebook, it's called Conspiro Media. And you can find links to all his stuff, including his YouTube channel, which is called Conspiro TV. Mr. Matt Sergiou, are you there?
I'm there. I'm here. Hello.
Yeah, we had trouble connecting, man, with Skype today. What's going on with that? But
well, I haven't used Skype in, I can't remember the last time I used it. Long time ago, because all the podcasts that I do tend to do now tend to be via Zoom. A lot of the people that I deal with go for Zoom. You know, Skype has become like a dinosaur almost.
So you're telling me you haven't used Skype since the last time you used it? That's fascinating, Matt. I love you, man.
I was trying to be polite. I was trying to say that it's a dinosaur, and the last time I used it was with you.
Oh no, with
the
dinosaur himself. Matt, remind the audience, though, who is Matt Sergiou? Remind us about Conspiro TV, Conspiro, Occult Beatles, and all the Conspiro Media, all the stuff you do.
You want to know about that?
Yes, remind us who you are.
Remind you. Okay, I'll try and be as brief as possible because you do know, don't you? I mean, we've spoken before, and you do know I tend to go off in tangents, and what could be said in 1 minute tends with me to be said in 1 hour. So I'll try and be brief. Okay, I'm an ex-club DJ. I was a journalist for a time, for a mainstream journalist back in the day. Not for long. It was mainly on radio here in the UK, where I'm based, where I live. And I've been involved. I was a club DJ from when I left school, when I was 16, 17, up until about 10 years ago, when I decided to just stop doing it for various reasons, although I am tempted to go back into it. I also do radio as well, radio shows, music-based shows, none of this kind of conspiratorial or occult stuff, although sometimes I do veer off into it when I do shows, radio shows, even on the mainstream. I'll kind of like throw in a few truth bombs, if you like, into the show. What happened was, when I started to get into the conspiratorial side of things, when I was interested in that, sort of around the 2000s, I began to look. It's only natural that I would, given that I've got a DJ background, a musical background. I started to look at the musical side of that, you know, of the so-called alternative versions of history, and it ended up that interest ended up becoming a blog, which is Conspiro Media, which I think I started in 2011, 2012, and what Conspiro Media is now, what it's been since 2016, the focus of it has moved away from what it used to be, whereas I used to look at very topical news items to do with music and movies and TV. So I would look at, say, for example, what was topical in the charts, the music charts at the time, bands or acts like Rihanna, for example, or Nicki Minaj, that kind of thing. I would also look at other eras as well, like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles and all of the rest of that kind of thing. But it got to the point where I was getting really bored of doing that, because how many times can you write an article where you say, oh, look, here's Britney Spears with a hand over her eye. Here's another pop video with Katy Perry and, you know, Egyptian symbolism and all of that kind of thing. It got boring. There was nothing. It didn't interest me. It's not my kind of what interests me as a person. It's not what gives, it doesn't drive any passion in me. I'm not really interested in Rihanna's music or Britney Spears music. I like 60s. I like all kinds of music, to be honest, from all eras, including today's music. But I'm not really into the poppy side of things like Rihanna and Britney Spears. So I got to the point in 2016 where I was looking more and more at the 1960s counterculture, the so-called counterculture era. but from a UK perspective. And part of this was inspired by the work of Dave McGowan and his look at the Laurel Canyon scene and his book Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. I read that book. I listened to his interviews with, and read his articles online. And I got to the point, there was also a DVD I watched about Paul McCartney and the counterculture, which has never been made available on TV or streaming services. It's only available on DVD. And I've got it right next to me, actually. I'll just read you the title. Where is it? I said I had it right next to me, but I don't. Okay, I won't read you the title of it. But yeah, it's basically a video, a DVD, a documentary about Paul McCartney and the UK counterculture and his influence in that counterculture era. So those two combinations got me into thinking, well, because I watched that documentary and it focused in on a few movers and shakers of the time, the people that are said to have been responsible for making the UK counterculture scene in London happen and move along. And I looked and it talked about their backgrounds briefly. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, there's very Laurel Canyon-esque weird scenes type of stuff going on here with some of these people. So that combined with Dave McGowan's work, I started to think to myself, well, if there was a 60s countercultural conspiracy, if you like, a social engineering conspiracy going on in America, in LA, in Laurel Canyon, as Dave McGowan put forward, that, for example, a lot of these so-called anti-establishment music figures that were telling their young listeners and fans to stick it to the man actually were taking these young people's ideals and their voices of dissent with regards to civil rights and the Vietnam War and taking it down a cul-de-sac, if you like, where those voices of protest couldn't be an effect against bringing down what they're trying to protest against. If that was going on in America, and of course Dave McGowan also said that a lot of these so-called anti-establishment music stars like Jim Morrison, for example, Dave Crosby of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, they also had these so-called elite backgrounds. So they were actually part of the establishment. Their bloodlines have establishment connections. So that's what Dave McGowan was saying. And I was thinking to myself, well, if that was going on in America, it must have been going on in the UK, because when we watch documentaries about the so-called 60s summer of love, we never really hear about Britain. It's always, when you watch a documentary, you always get to see the stock footage of the library footage or photographs of people dancing at Woodstock, or it's always about America. It's always about San Francisco. It's always about Timothy Leary, and that's all applicable. Of course, it's applicable. But I would suggest that there wouldn't have been such a huge countercultural movement in the 60s in the so-called Western world had it have not been for Great Britain as well. So I started to look at that with regards to McGowan, what he was saying in America about America. I was thinking, well, if there was all this, if there was a conspiracy in America going on, these weird scenes in the canyon, in Laurel Canyon, then that must have been going on in London. So that's what I did. I started digging into this in 2016. And from 2016 onwards, if you look at my site, Conspiro Media, much of the focus has been on the UK counterculture of 1960s Britain, 1960s London. And I've been working on this since then, documenting all my research, reading mountains of books, the odd podcast, the odd article, the odd interview with people such as yourself. And I do hope to bring this all into a book at some stage. When that will happen, I don't know. But if you look at the British countercultural scene, I would argue that it wouldn't.
Yeah, it seems like it also to Tavistock, and it seems like even more so it was controlled. And when I think it was you or one of your friends in your group, because I see Mark Devlin up here too on your Conspiro TV. And by the way, I'm looking at I've never watched Conspiro TV. I mean, I confess, but when you go on YouTube and I look at the topics of these shows, these are all excellent topics. Manson, all great stuff here. The Beatles stuff, all kind of great stuff. But
thank you.
Oh no, yeah. And by the way, you mentioned Dave McGowan. You know, it's so funny. People, if the audience wants to check out Dave McGowan, just Google Ed Opperman, Spreaker McGowan. I interviewed him early on. And all those books he's talking about, I have autographed copies of all those books, man, Dave sent me. But the first time I interviewed Dave, he was like, well, why would anybody want to interview me?
But he's a game changer.
Yeah.
That was a signpost moment. That's a landmark moment. His work is now it changed the map, if you like, with regards to music research, especially pop culture, if you like. If you're looking at it from an alternative, quote unquote, conspiratorial, even occult perspective or nature, he was the game changer. If he hadn't have come along, I would suggest we wouldn't have gone down the roads that we've gone in, and we wouldn't have discovered. There'd be closed doors now. There'd be locked doors. We wouldn't even know where those doors are without Dave McGowan's work. He opened our eyes to a lot. He was a signpost. Not signpost. He was a landmark. It was landmark research, you know.
Oh, yeah. And sadly, we did lose him to cancer, fast-acting cancer. So he's been passed away a good 5 years or so, at least. Yeah. Heartbreaking. One of your films here and that we wanted to talk about was the Bloomsbury Tour, London, Social Engineers, and the 60s UK. What's going on there, the Bloomsbury area of London?
Well, the Bloomsbury area, wow. Well, it's in the West End of London, if I'm not mistaken. It's a district in the West End of London. It's called Bloomsbury. And fairly early on in my research, when I started looking into the British so-called counterculture, even though people who were there at the time have since emailed me when I was putting up initial podcasts and said to me, hey, man, they say to me, look, man, I was there at the time. Love your work. It's great. But you've got to realize that we didn't call it counterculture. We called it underground. It was the underground movement. I don't know what they called it in America. I have to say that a lot of my research is regarding Britain. When America does come into it, it does accidentally sometimes. Whilst I'm looking at the research of, whilst I'm looking at the UK counterculture scene, sometimes, as is the nature of research, you will find out things about other aspects that you're not looking at necessarily. So sometimes the American stuff is some of that stuff that I'm not out to look for it, and it does turn up. So I do sometimes come across American information about what was going on in America at the time, but yeah, predominantly I'm looking at London. I can't speak for America.
But real quick though, in the 60s and 70s in the U.S., underground. Well, first of all, we had the underground press, which later on Tom Forsyth from High Times Magazine did go in there and take over. He kind of commandeered it, like as a tough guy. But then the other thing with underground would be if you were to, you didn't want to go to the draft, you don't want to go to Vietnam, you would go underground. And back in those days, it was really easy because they didn't even have your picture on your driver's license in the United States back in the 60s and 70s. It was a card they gave you. So it was very easy to make fake ID and to get utilities and rent an apartment and get a bank account without identification. You could go underground in those days and disappear.
Yeah. I think in the British context in the 60s, it meant something completely different. I think I might be wrong, but I think they called it underground because they were out of the radar in terms of culture. So music, art, concerts, events that they would hold. It was away from the spotlight of the mainstream media and the mainstream population. Of course, it didn't. It started that way, but of course, as a lot of these underground movements, they start off in a sort of small. If you look at movements, whether it's a music movement or a whatever, they always start off, as an underground or as a fringe thing, and then the mainstream, when they see that they can make a few dollars out of it or a few pounds out of it, then they start to put the spotlight on it. Of course, that's what happens, and that's what happened in the UK with this so-called underground scene. It started in about 1965, and by 1967, along with America, it became it was commercialized, basically. You know, the major retailers, the record companies, movie makers, producers, directors latched onto it and made it, you know, like hippies, you know, they made it into this huge commercial enterprise.
Yeah, like the last episode of Mad Men, the advertising series here in the States, where they took the Coca-Cola, it's the real thing.
Yeah.
You know, and they capitalized off it, you know. But from our perspective, you know, looking back at Dave McGowan's work, that was all planned to begin with. You know, the whole thing was created by those same marketing guys, you know, who, you know. But
yeah. But this is the thing. How organic was it? That's the question that Dave was asking, of course. How organic was it? You know, were these, you know, was the counterculture movement in America organic, or was it, you know, as he suggests, socially engineered from almost day one, you know, to, you know, herd a population, the younger population down a cul-de-sac, as it were, and to get them into LSD as well, and acid and all of that, and the breakdown of the family unit with free love and sexual permissiveness and all of that. So, yeah, did the same thing happen in London? Well, that's what I'm trying to find out. So with regards to Bloomsbury, early on in my research, when I was looking into the 60s so-called underground scene, I also began to be quite intrigued as to how it came into being in the first place. What were its roots? So if you look back, you can say that the beat poets, the beat, you know, the Allen Ginsberg and Kerouac and Burroughs, those characters, you could say that they were very much an inspiration to what, in the late 50s, early 60s, to what was to be the counterculture underground, the hippies, if you like, in 66, 67. They were, those beat poets were an inspiration on that. But I've looked further back to the early part of the 20th century, and again, I'm talking about the UK here.
Hey, can I interrupt you for 1 second, because you mentioned Allen Ginsberg, who I've met, by the way. I've met Allen Ginsberg down at Yippie headquarters, but he was notorious later on in his life for being a pederast, for being a But according to A.J. Weberman, who was the Yippie, he wrote the book Coup d'Etat in America, and he's one of the big shot Yippies over there. He's still around today. He was head of the Jewish Defense Organization. He was in an apartment with Ginsberg and George Soros. And according to A.J. Weberman, and he knew Lenin, he knew Maypang, he knew Yoko, he knew all these guys, you know. He was in an apartment with Ginsberg and George Soros, and Ginsberg gave oral sex to George Soros. Okay, man.
Why doesn't that surprise me? Nothing surprises me anymore. Do you know what I mean?
Tell Dave McGowan to tell that story. Okay, Dave McGowan to tell you that one.
Well, apparently what Ginsberg liked to do was to take his clothes off and walk around in public. I don't know if you know this story. I can't remember who recited this story. But apparently this is early on in the Beatles' success. This would have been around 63, 64. There was a party, I don't know if all the Beatles and their wives and partners went to this party, or if it was just John Lennon and his then wife Cynthia and George Harrison and Patty, his then girlfriend, soon to be his wife. I'm not sure, but 2 or more of the Beatles and their partners' wives went to this party. And I can't remember the exact details of it, but apparently Allen Ginsberg walked in stark naked. Just this cocktail party. I think it was like a cocktail party, and in walks Ginsberg and takes all his clothes off, completely naked, standing next to John Lennon, I think it was. And I think John Lennon said to him, aren't you getting a bit cold? Don't you think you should put a coat on? They weren't too happy with him because they were with their wives / partners. But yeah, he had a tendency to do that. I don't know what his game was. I don't know if he was looking to shock everyone in the room, or whether he was looking for or whether he thought he was turning up to some kind of mass orgy or something. I really don't know. But apparently, from what I understand, this was a cocktail party. So, yeah, Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. And we were talking off the air about the new film called A Lost Week and a Love Story with May Pang. That just came. In fact, it's not out yet. October 13th, it's coming out. You can get it streaming online. Excellent film, and it really fleshes out all the stuff of their relationship and their time together, their time with Phil Spector, with Terry Melcher comes up quite a bit in the story, and the film itself is very open about Yoko, but when I interviewed May, she was not. Okay, she was not as open as the film was. I had hoped after seeing the film, but I would recommend that film to anybody who's interested in Matt Sergiou and his work to check out that film as well.
Did she mention the hypnotism?
Yes, we talked about the hypnotism. It's in the film more, but we talked about the hypnotism, but she was nervous.
Yeah.
It's up on my Patreon if anybody wants to go there right now.
Yeah. I'm surprised she called it The Lost Weekend, because in past days, over the decades, whenever she's spoken in interviews, she's always, because it was John Lennon that came up with this term, The Lost Weekend, right, as though to insinuate because basically John Lennon has always gave us the official John and Yoko story, and since he passed away, since he died, was killed, Yoko Ono has perpetuated this official John and Yoko story, hasn't she? They have their own version of history, which has been contested by many, many, many people who knew them and that were there at the time. The John and Yoko story basically is a love story, isn't it? It's very romantic. Whereas if you ask people who are connected to them, that we get an opposite side of events. And May Pang is one of those that said that and done that in public, said that. So the thing is, the Lost Weekend, this term, is a term that was given by John Lennon as though to suggest that when Yoko Ono kicked him out of his house and they split for 18 months or so, that he went into a period of a lost weekend. Lost weekend meaning, of course, to him, or as he wanted us to believe in this official narrative, that he was lost. Without Yoko, he couldn't operate. He went into a whirlwind of drugs and booze and uncontrollable rages and manic depression and confusion and all of that mental anguish. But May Pang has always said, well, no, it wasn't actually a lost weekend. It wasn't lost at all, because he did a lot of stuff when he was with me. He recorded a #1 hit with David Bowie. He recorded Fame. He recorded a hit with Elton John. He recorded 1 or 2 really good albums. He got back with Paul McCartney and there was talk of a reunion. There was all this stuff going on. He produced Harry Nilsson's album.
Reunited with Julian, we were sent off
reunited with his estranged son Julian from his first marriage. Right. So I'm quite surprised.
Oh, did I lose you?
Gone with that title, Lost Weekend, because
I think
it as not actually being true. So I don't know why she done that.
Well, you know what? I don't think she had that much control over the title. But a couple of things that came out too is that they would meet up for 5 years after the big breakup, after he went back with Yoko. Okay. You knew that?
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That was something there. And also too, we talk about some people who try and stand up to Yoko. I had a fellow booked to come on my show. He wound up in jail before he could come on the show. Had a beef with Yoko. So I don't blame people for being nervous.
Yeah. She's not very well these days. She's suffered, and she announced, I think it was on Twitter. She announced on Twitter a few years back that she'd had an illness. Nobody knows what that illness is, quote unquote. But if you see pictures of her, which aren't very rare, but these days, if you do see any pictures of her, she's in a wheelchair, and she's moved out of the Dakota where she lived for 50 years, from 1973 to this year, 2023. She's moved out. I think she's gone to live somewhere in the countryside, I think, away from there. So she's not well. I think she's 90 this year, wasn't she? She was born in 1933. So, but even at that stage, people are still scared of her,
Well, they got a big machine. So what we only got about 30 minutes left. What can you tell us about this Bloomsbury tour?
Oh my goodness, in 30 minutes. Okay. Right, second gear, third, fourth. Vroom. Right, okay. So the Bloomsbury area is a district in the west of London. As I was saying before, I've been looking at the 60s so-called counterculture of the UK and London, and I was looking for its roots, if you like. So we got the beat poets of the late 50s, early 60s, who were very, very, very influential on what was to become the counterculture of the 60s in 66, 67, and a little bit after that. But if you look further back to the beginning of pretty much to the beginning of the 20th century, and again, I'm talking here from a British perspective, it would seem that there was a group of people who were known as the Bloomsbury Group, who may have been also influential on the 60s so-called counterculture. Now, at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2023, I went on a short city break to London. It's about 2 hours drive from where I live, and I booked a hotel. And I booked the hotel, and I didn't realise until after I booked it, when I actually got to London, that I'd actually booked it in Bloomsbury, this district in the west of London. And I thought, interesting, because I didn't do it deliberately, but it was on my radar, so to speak, in my head. I'd been thinking about this Bloomsbury group, this group of poets, artists, writers who used to meet, and they used to meet in Bloomsbury, hence why they were called the Bloomsbury Group. But yeah, so I took a walk around Bloomsbury, and I noticed that there were a lot of buildings where a lot of prominent English people used to live or work, and it got my juices flowing, my creative it inspired me, if you like, to look closer into it. So we returned to London a month or two later, and we stayed at the same hotel, and I took I'd done some research in the meantime, bought some books on this Bloomsbury Group and looked into them and their backgrounds, and I decided to make a video. So I went out and I took some video shots on my phone of various locations around the Bloomsbury area. Then when I got home, I made it into a video, a presentation, and it's now on my YouTube page. Yeah, and it's, I think you said earlier, it's called The Bloomsbury Tour London, Social Engineers and the 60s UK Counterculture. And basically, it's like a street tour. And yeah, so basically the Bloomsbury Group, they were a group of book publishers, writers, artists, poets, and they used to meet. And the reason they're called the Bloomsbury Group is because they used to meet for drinks and conversation. And this started around 1904. They would meet at number 46 Gordon Square in Bloomsbury, in this district in London called Bloomsbury. And this house where they used to meet was where Virginia Woolf lived for a time, the author Virginia Woolf, and she was one of the main members of this Bloomsbury Group. Other Bloomsbury Group members included the artist Duncan Grant. There was also fellow artist and art critic Roger Fry, the novelist E.M. Forster, and David Garnett, also the writer David Garnett, and also Lytton Strachey, who was a writer as well. And the thing about the Bloomsbury Group, what got me thinking about them with regards to the 60s so-called counterculture, is that the Bloomsbury Group, if you look at them, they were more than what I'm about. They were more than what I'm about to tell you. But basically, they were a group of free thinkers. This is the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s. They were sexually permissive. They were supportive of homosexuality. And this was at a time, this was 60 or so years before homosexuality was made legal in England. So at this time, if you were homosexual, you had to hide it, because there was the chance that it would ruin your, the reputation of being found to be gay would mean the end of your career. It would mean, your family life being destroyed, and prison. You could go to jail if you were a homosexual man, and you could go to jail for this. So they were. They were open about homosexuality in the early 1900s. And yeah, they had this kind of sexually permissive thing going on. So yeah, it's like some commentators mainstream commentators who've looked at the Bloomsbury Group have suggested that they were like a precursor to what went on in the 1960s, that this little group of people were a smaller version of what would take over the so-called Western world in the so-called Summer of Love. Just to give you an example of how permissive these guys were, they were permissive amongst each other. There's one author I've read who's described their relationship together as a merry-go-round, a sexual merry-go-round. So, for example, you've got Vanessa Woolf, Virginia Woolf's sister. Now, she lived at number 46 Gordon Square, this house where the group initially met. She lived with her sister there, Virginia. Vanessa was married to fellow Bloomsbury Group member Clive Bell, another member of the Bloomsbury Group there. They married in 1907, and then following this, Virginia and her husband Leonard Woolf moved out, and Vanessa and Clive remained living there. They stayed there till about 1916, and they had 2 sons together before their marriage fell apart. And then Vanessa began a brief affair with fellow Bloomsbury Group member Roger Fry. Then she went into a relationship with fellow Bloomsbury Group member Duncan Grant, with whom she had a child with. And during all this time, she and Clive, her husband, stayed married, yet apart, under a so-called mutual understanding. And so I'm led to understand Clive went on to have many mistresses in this time, during this time as well. So this is what was going on, and 46 Gordon Square wasn't the only house in Bloomsbury that Gordon Square is basically, if you go there, there's a park, a public park, and surrounding this public as a garden square, and surrounding it are these beautiful Edwardian houses, these terraced houses, which I dare suggest are worth millions now if you were to try and buy one. Beautiful houses. Now, this is Gordon Square, and it's not only number 46 Gordon Square where this was going on. There was other houses on that square where members of this Bloomsbury group were living and socialising and getting involved in this sexual merry-go-round. So they were very intertwined. You had number 51 Gordon Square. Lytton Strachey lived there between 1909 and 1924. You had number 50 Gordon Square. There was also number 37 Gordon Square, as well as number 46 Gordon Square. So this is what was going on at the time.
Matt, what about nearby restaurants, shops, bars? What was going on there?
I've got no idea.
Oh, really?
No idea whatsoever. I think what they used to do is they used to meet in each other's homes and just talk.
So is this like farm area, farm, rural? What is it like? No, city.
Oh, no. It's right in the middle of the city. You've got the British Museum there.
Okay.
This is, it's the West End of London. This is like the most expensive part of London. Very much a city. I've got a quote here from Virginia Woolf from her memoirs, Moments of Being, and this is what she says about homosexuality and her attitude and the Bloomsbury Group's attitude to homosexuality. She says, "So there was nothing that one could not say, nothing that one could not do at 46 Gordon Square. It was, I think, a great advance in civilization. It may be true that the loves of buggers are not, or at least if one of the is of the other persuasion, of enthralling or paramount importance. But the fact that they can be mentioned openly leads to the fact that no one minds if they are practiced privately. Thus, many customs and beliefs were revised. Indeed, the future of Bloomsbury was to prove that many variations can be played on the theme of sex." Now, to tie this in, again, keeping it within the framework of sexual permissiveness pre-60s, and possible signs that there is a Laurel Canyon-esque thing going on here. And what I mean by that is, what are the backgrounds of these Bloomsbury groupers? Do they have nefarious backgrounds? There's another prominent member of the Bloomsbury Group, and I think you might have heard of him. His name is John Maynard Keynes. He was born in 1883. He's been described as one of the most influential economists of the 20th century. Indeed, there's a brand of economics that he devised, if you like, he invented, if you want to say that, if you want to describe it like that, called Keynesian economics, sure, which is applicable to this very day. During the First World War, he worked at the Treasury, which is the UK government's economic and finance ministry, and did so again during the Second World War on the request of the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer, in other words, the UK's finance minister. When the UK government went for a loan from the US government after the end of the Second World War, Keynes actually led the British delegation to Washington to get this.
Let me answer for 1 second, because people here in the States would know this as Keynesian. It's pronounced Keynes here, Keynes, and Keynesian economics, which is basically the origin of welfare. Am I correct? Or
yeah,
right? Yeah.
In a roundabout way. Economics is definitely not finance and all that kind of stuff. My eyelids tend to sort of get really heavy at that point. I'm just terrible at that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, it might interest you to know. I don't know if you know this, but yeah, it's called Keynesian economics. But his name is actually. It looks like it's Keynes, but you pronounce his name Keynes.
I've always said Keynes.
I know.
You know what? Probably because I read it before I heard it. You know.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Same here. Same here. But yeah, if you're looking for nefarious connections, well, some might say that Keynesian economics isn't nefarious in itself, but he was also a significant founding father of the IMF. The International Monetary Fund, and also the World Bank, which were both created in 1944, if I'm not mistaken. So here we have a group of so-called free thinkers who are artists who live this permissive lifestyle. So if you look at it on that kind of level, if you don't know about their backgrounds, if you don't know about the IMF and the World Bank and all of that kind of thing, if you're thinking the Bloomsbury Group and free thinking and art and poetry, you might think to yourself, oh, what a lovely bunch of guys, they're so, it's just so beautiful, man. But then when you actually look at their backgrounds, they've got these links that go to the IMF and all the rest of it. But yeah, John Maynard Keynes was a bit of he was on this merry-go-round as well. Now, he was married. He was married to a Russian ballerina, I think, but he was actually homosexual. Yeah, he was involved in this sexual so-called merry-go-round within the Bloomsbury Group. It's been written, for example, that Keynes had been sexually involved with Lytton Strachey, who I mentioned earlier. He was involved with him. Also, his brother James, he was involved with James Strachey as well. But it's said that the great male love of Keynes's life was Duncan Grant, another Bloomsbury Group member who I mentioned earlier, of course. And Duncan Grant was actually involved with Lytton Strachey as well. And Lytton Strachey was Duncan Grant's cousin. So this is the kind of world of this is what was going on within the Bloomsbury Group. Now, someone who was friendly with the Bloomsbury Group, he wasn't a Bloomsbury grouper, but he was a friend of the Bloomsbury Group, was Bertrand Russell.
Oh, really?
Now, yeah, he was, as just in case no one knows who he was, he died, I think, in 1970, or 69 or 70. He was a British philosopher, mathematician, writer. Said to be, he's put on a pedestal, isn't he? Like this great thinker of his generation, of his time, this great mind, this wonderful man. But if you look into his background, you might think differently. Now he had a flat in Bloomsbury. He actually had an apartment in Bloomsbury, and if you look at my video, you'll see that I actually go to this building. It's called Russell Chambers. The building itself is called Russell Chambers, and it's just about a 1 or 2 minute walk away from the British Museum. Now, Bertrand Russell does connect to the 60s so-called counterculture in the UK, whether deliberately or not, whether consciously or not, he does, because Bertrand Russell was the founder, or one of the main founders, the main founding fathers of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, otherwise known as the CND. I don't think this is huge in America. I think this is more of a British thing. This came about in the late 1950s. I think it was 58 or 59. I might be wrong, but sometime around then. So this is in the midst of the so-called, or within the atmosphere, if you like, of the so-called Cold War. Basically, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament was an organisation which was put together to protest against against nuclear weapons, to get Russia and the Soviet Union and America and Britain and all the other so-called Western countries of Western Europe to stop making nuclear weapons and to come to some kind of agreement with each other. That's what it was about. It was protesting against nuclear proliferation, if you like. Now, if you look at the CND, even if you've never heard of the CND, you will know their logo, by the way. Okay. And this will link us to the 60s counterculture again. This is just one of the links. Their logo is what you might call the peace sign. That was it was known as the CND logo. It still is. The CND is still with us, but it got co-opted, if you like, or it got adopted and used, and is now used as a peace sign. So that in itself was used in the 60s, wasn't it, by so-called hippies and the so-called Summer of Love, and when protesting against the Vietnam War, people would walk around with placards with this sign adorned on the placard. Another way in which the CND was very much an influence on the UK 60s counterculture is that a lot of the people that were involved at the time in CND would later become the hippies, the so-called hippies. So this is pre-hippie 60s, late 50s, very early 60s Britain, okay? This is pre-hippie. Basically, what a lot of the people who... There were people who were involved in the UK so-called counterculture who look back on those days in the CND. And basically what they say about the CND is it was hugely popular. They used to hold marches in the late 50s, early 60s called the Aldermaston Marches, where they would march, I think, if I'm not mistaken, they would march from London. This would happen on Easter holidays. They would march from London to the village of Aldermaston, where the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment was based. And they would do this once a year on Easter. And tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of people joined the CND. Now, what people within the countercultural scene have said in reflection is what the CND became, whether on purpose or not, whether deliberately or not, was it was the catalyst for what would become the hippie, because the CND attracted a cross-section of the British population. You had mums and dads, priests, people in the clergy, grandmothers, grandfathers.
Well, then CND, was it ban the bomb? Was it a peace movement?
It was a ban the bomb. It was basically a ban the bomb. Yeah. Okay. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. So there was this cross-section of people that all mixed together, but mixed in with these mums and dads and grandfathers and what have you were also beatniks, what you would then now call, or what was called at the time, the beatniks. People from the left field of society, people who are on the outskirts of mainstream society, beatniks, that kind of thing. So basically, bohemians, if you like.
Ginsberg came out of the beat movement in the United States, at least.
Yeah, exactly. So these, people in Britain who were switched on to Ginsberg and into the folk music scene, which was very much part of the early 60s protest scene against nuclear disarmament in Britain. They would sing songs about it. That was all. It's all mixed in. People in Britain who were into Ginsberg and all of that. You could they were the beatniks, and so you had these beatniks and all these various so-called bohemians that were mixing together within the CND, meeting at these marches, and they suddenly met each other. Because this was pre-internet days, of course, so there wasn't a social network, as it were. So if you were a beatnik living in a village in England, and there was another guy who had similar views to you living in, say, in a city like Birmingham or Manchester, you're not going to meet each other. So this became a catalyst, a meeting place for all these like-minded people on the peripheries of society who were looking down at the establishment, as it were, and they began to meet. And it was a breeding ground, if you like, for what would later become the underground movement of 60s London. The hippie movement, if you want to call it that, the counterculture. Now, one of those who was very, very much involved with the CND was a guy by the name of John Hopkins, or known to his friends and close associates, John Hoppy Hopkins. And again, we're going into the realms here of kind of Laurel Canyon-esque type things. If you ask anybody who was, and I would say this with some surety, I would say if you ask anybody, just about anybody who was involved, like movers and shakers within the 60s countercultural scene of London, they will tell you that the main driving force, the leader of the 60s counterculture movement of London, aka Britain, was John Hoppy Hopkins. He was the guy who made things happen. He was the guy who was the flag wave bearer. So all the events that took place in London, such as the free school movement, IT, International Times, which was said to be Europe's first underground newspaper. He was the instigator of that. He made it happen. There were other people involved with it, obviously, of course, teams of writers and editors and all the rest of it, but reporters. But yeah, he was the instigator for all these things. Also, the event UFO, which was a weekly event where people could go and listen to countercultural music, psychedelic music, light shows, that kind of thing. This was a weekly event in London. He was the instigator of that. He was also the instigator of the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, which was this huge, like, rave. It was like a rave before raves happened in the 80s and 90s. Again, a countercultural psychedelic event where the music acts, liquid lights, all that kind of thing. It was going on in the States as well. So he was the main mover and shaker, the de facto leader of this movement. Now, if you look at his background, so here we have this guy, Hoppy Hopkins, who's sticking it to the man, okay, anti-establishment supposedly. If you look at his background, his father was a naval engineer, okay, and he was educated, and Hoppy was educated at Cambridge University. Very quickly, Cambridge University is one of two so-called elite universities in Britain. It's where kings and queens and go to study. Bill Clinton, prime ministers, presidents from around the world, barons, earls, you name it. It's Cambridge and Oxford universities are the two so-called elite universities. So here we have this guy who's sticking it to the man, who somehow got himself into Cambridge University, son of a naval engineer. Okay, then when he left university, he went to work as a nuclear physicist at the British government's atomic energy research establishment in the village of Harwell in the county of Oxfordshire in Britain. Right, okay. And
we only got about 5 minutes left.
Okay, so I'll round this off by saying that he was. The thing is, while he was working at Harwell, he went on a holiday, on a vacation, to communist Russia to go and take part or to see a communist youth rally. So, and apparently he went there in a 1936 funeral hearse. You can't make this stuff up. Now, how is it that a guy who is attached to a government agency, who is a nuclear scientist working for the British government, is allowed or somehow gets to go to communist Russia, to the Soviet Union, for this to go to this communist rally? I don't know how he managed how this happened, how it didn't get stopped in some way, shape or form. But apparently when he came back, what happened was he was debriefed by MI6, I think it was. It was MI5 or MI6 actually debriefed him about this. Because, what was he doing, going to, and apparently they offered him a job. MI6 offered, or MI5 or whoever was offered him a job. And according to his friends, he passed the offer down. Okay, believe that or not.
Yeah, Clinton also went to Russia. Clinton also went to Russia.
Yeah, what is this all about? Yeah. And then he left, and this is very Laurel Canyon-esque. He left his job as a nuclear scientist. He went to London and became a freelance photographer working for the main newspapers and magazines of Britain as a photographer. And he was photographing the Beatles, the Stones, Bertrand Russell, William Burroughs, Martin Luther King. So here's a guy and he claims that he became a photographer after he graduated from university. His godfather gave him a camera. So he decided to teach himself from having no knowledge of how to use a camera apart from the basics. He self-taught himself how to use his camera. to the point that he sent a photograph to a local newspaper. And the local newspaper put it up in their paper. And he thought to himself, gosh, I think I can become a photographer, like earn a living from this. So after leaving his job or getting pushed out of his nuclear physicist job, he goes to London, becomes a trainee for about a year or so. And then he goes freelance and ends up, would you believe, working in Fleet Street of London, which was at the time the main street in London where all the main newspapers are. All the main magazines, all the main newspapers are. Fancy that. This is very Laurel Canyon-esque. And then, so he goes from doing... So here he is. He's taking photographs of, the Beatles. He manages to get himself into this world where he's photographing all these famous people, these big names of the 60s. And then about a year or two after that, he becomes the de facto leader of the UK underground countercultural movement. So that for me is just one example. There are others, but that's just one example of a Laurel Canyon-esque kind of thing,
Yeah, we got to check out Matt Sergiou's YouTube page called Conspiro TV, and this one video we're talking about is the Bloomsbury tour. This is incredible stuff, Matt. We got to have you come back on more often, Matt. Okay, while Matt was talking, I was going to interject and tell him about how the music industry, many of these recording studios had military-industrial complex connections.
Well, we talked about
that. Yeah, I know. I went looking up the show and you were the guest. I was going to tell you about it. All right, so we're going to play some Matt Sergiou marathons on our repeats on Spreaker this week. Matt Sergiou, conspiromedia.wordpress.com, occultbeatles.wordpress.com. You go on Facebook, and Conspiro Media, you have links to everything, all this stuff. If you can't remember, WordPress.com. Conspiro TV on YouTube. And Opperman Report Spreaker channel has a channel for Occult Beatles for some old material he did for us.
Yeah.
Great. And what do you want to leave us with? Real quick, 1 minute.
Okay, real quick. Well, if you go take a look at that video, although I'm very happy to come back and continue this, you will see that the Bloomsbury Group also ties into eugenics. Oh, really? It also ties in, through Bertrand Russell, it ties into the London School of Economics. Again, I'm just London School of Economics, the Fabian Society,
wow.
And also the Tavistock Institute. In fact, the Tavistock Clinic began in Bloomsbury, in Tavistock Square in 1920, at number 51 Tavistock Square, next door to where Virginia Woolf lived.
How do you feel about coming back tomorrow? I'll have you come back tomorrow same time?
I'll check
see what you can do.
I'll check my schedule and see what I'm doing.
Have your people call my people. But the thing also, you talk about, these guys who become photographers, that's definitely an intelligence area where they are intelligence cover. And that guy who took the last picture of Mark David Chapman and John Lennon, I forget his name off the top of my head now.
Goresh. Is it David Goresh?
Right, there you go. He's dead now. We can talk about him. This character, I found out more recently, the first time he met Lennon, he was pretending to be a VCR repairman. When you hear the interviews with this guy, his dream was to become a cop. So he was working as a security officer. But after taking this one photograph, people like the Beach Boys and people like that wanted him to come and take pictures of them. He became a photographer. Interesting.
And I've always been a little bit suspicious about Brian Wilson, his state of mind and
connections to Manson and that whole crew too as well.
And the guy that he was with, I can't remember his name.
Terry Melcher.
No, the guru that he was with for a while in the 80s.
Oh, right, the psychiatrist, right. They put him in a sandbox. That weird as weird can be. Speaking of weird, Matt Sergiou, conspiromedia.wordpress.com, Occult Beatles. Check out all this stuff, man. Great content, bro. We got to have you back more often, okay? But check your schedule. Get back to me.
I will. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, sir. Good night.
Good night.